Early in the morning on the 10th of January 2021, police officers knocked on the door of apartment number 48 on Gogol Street in a quiet district of Novgorod. For more than a week, residents of the building had been complaining about a strange and unpleasant smell coming from this door. Inside was Louisa, 34 years old, wife of local engineer Daniel. Neighbors had long grown accustomed to the fact that Louisa rarely left the house, and that in recent months she had hardly been seen. No one answered repeated calls, so the police decided to break down the door. The lock gave way quickly. When the door opened, the officers had to cover their noses. The smell was so strong that they could only enter after a couple of minutes, already wearing special respirators. In the bedroom, in complete unsanitary conditions on a destroyed bed, lay Louisa. It was immediately clear. Help was no longer possible. The apartment looked abandoned and absolutely did not correspond to the usual environment of living quarters. Old newspapers, empty plastic bottles, food packages with long expired dates lay on the floor. In the bathroom, they found an empty first aid kit. There were not even basic painkillers or first aid supplies. In the kitchen, the shelves were almost empty. In the refrigerator lay only a dried loaf of bread and half a bottle of water. Among this ruin on the table was a noticeable stack of mail, unpaid electricity bills, reminders from the bank. No one had sorted through these documents for several weeks. On the walls in the hallway, they noticed traces of dust and cobwebs, as if no one had come here for a long time and touched nothing. These details would soon become important evidence, but now they looked only like symptoms of deep neglect. Immediately after opening the apartment, police discovered that in the neighboring room sat Louisa's husband, Daniel, a 39-year-old man, engineer at a local factory. His condition was severe, his gaze unfocused, his hands slightly trembling. When police asked why he had not reported earlier, Daniel answered that he had discovered Louisa just now, literally the morning of the previous day. He claimed that he returned from work and saw that she was unwell. He tried to wake her up, but realized it was too late, and therefore, according to him, was in shock and could not gather his thoughts to call the police. This looked convincing, but caused wariness. It was difficult to believe that the smell and environment, which had obviously formed not in one day, had not bothered him before. While a forensics team worked with Daniel, neighbors told police another important detail. Once a month, a person they called medical worker came to Louisa. He came briefly, for about half an hour, after which he quickly disappeared. None of the neighbors could name his name or physical features except that he was dressed in medical uniform, and apparently none of the neighbors knew him personally. This added uncertainty to the case. Who was he, and why did he appear so rarely? There were no answers yet. Initially, the picture of the incident looked quite typical for cases that police had encountered before. A sharp deterioration in health, possibly caused by a chronic disease or sudden illness. In conditions of neglect and without medical care, this seemed a logical explanation. Police preliminarily recorded in the protocol that, most likely, a tragic accident had occurred. This version allowed easy explanation of what was happening without attracting unnecessary suspicions. However, experienced officers noted details that did not fit the general picture: the complete absence of medicines, the abandoned apartment, and most importantly, the extremely strange reaction of the husband, who, being conscious, seemed not to notice what was happening right under his nose. Late in the evening of the same day, the police department received a preliminary conclusion from the forensic medical examiner. He reported one important and unexpected detail. From Louisa's condition, it was obvious that she had been in such a state for at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks, not a day, as Daniel claimed. This meant that the husband was either intentionally misleading the police or did not understand at all what was happening around him. Both versions looked strange and required further investigation. However, The expert did not immediately voice the cause, limiting himself only to this information. It completely changed the direction of the investigation and cast doubt on the initial version of accident. Police attention now switched to one person, Daniel. The next steps were obvious. It was necessary to carefully study his every word, every action, and understand whether he was really so shocked by what he saw or was hiding something more important. Why had Daniel not sought medical help for Louisa for almost 6 months? The answer to this question could shed light on the situation in the apartment where the tragedy occurred. Police understood that this was not a simple oversight, but a conscious decision that possibly concealed a deeper and more dangerous motive. The first step was studying the spouse's bank accounts. The financial check showed an important and alarming detail. Over the last 6 months, disability social benefits had been steadily coming to Louisa's personal account. The amounts were small, about 15,000 rubles monthly, but more important was the fact itself. Money regularly arrived and was just as regularly withdrawn. The last transaction went through just a few days before police broke down the apartment door. Withdrawals occurred at the same ATM, a few minutes' walk from the spouse's house, usually late in the evening. Surveillance camera recordings clearly show Daniel regularly once a month coming to this ATM and withdrawing money. No other persons were noticed in the recordings. The check found no traces that the withdrawn money went to paying utilities or purchasing medicines. On the contrary, bills were overdue, medicines were absent from the apartment, food was also practically non-existent. Thus the money went somewhere else. And this question became key at this stage of the investigation. When police spoke with Daniel again, presenting him with bank statements, he remained calm, but his answers did not convince the investigation. He claimed that all the money went to paying for caregiver services, allegedly hired by him personally to care for Louisa. This explanation could have looked convincing if Daniel could have confirmed his words with at least some documents. A contract, receipts, bank transfers, or at least the caregiver's phone number, but none of this was presented. He referred to trusting relationships, to the fact that payment was in cash, and that it was more convenient for him not to officially arrange services, saving time and money. Police recorded these words in the protocol, but in light of what was happening, they looked extremely doubtful. The situation became even worse when it turned out that neighbors had never seen any outside woman regularly entering the apartment, except for that same mysterious medical worker. And his visits, as previously established, occurred extremely rarely and lasted no more than half an hour. Police began leaning toward the version of financial motive. The fact that Daniel regularly withdrew Louisa's social benefits without providing her any care fit into a logical scheme of banal fraud. Given the condition of the apartment and what was happening in it, such a motive was obvious. Social assistance steadily arrived, and the absence of any control from social services allowed easy management of the money. It was assumed that Daniel intentionally concealed the deterioration of Louisa's condition, continuing to receive benefits. However, despite the logic and simplicity of this version, it remained open. While investigators gathered additional facts, the version of financial fraud looked very probable, but there were still many inconsistencies in it. It was exactly then, when this version was already beginning to seem primary, that one of the neighbors brought an unexpected piece of evidence to the police department. A photograph. The image captured a woman resembling Louisa, together with another woman who could have been the caregiver Daniel spoke about. The photograph was dated March 2020, approximately 9 months before the apartment was opened. What was notable, Louisa in the photo looked quite healthy. She was still moving freely, holding hands with that same unknown woman. The photo was taken in the courtyard of the house, against the background of trees and neighboring entrances. Police turned to the neighbor for details, but he could only confirm that he saw them together several times in March of the previous year. He considered this woman to be Louisa's helper, but as it turned out, no one saw her in subsequent months. Thus, police faced a new task: to identify the person in the photograph and find out why she no longer appeared, if she had ever been the caregiver Daniel spoke about. For now, this photo only added mysteries, leaving the investigation without clear answers. This evidence opened an unexpected turn, forcing investigators to reconsider all information and everything Daniel had said. The situation was becoming increasingly confusing. Investigators realized that behind simple fraud could be hidden something much more complex and dark, which they did not even suspect yet. No one from Louisa's circle understood why she found herself alone in a car on an empty highway at night when the accident occurred. During this period, Louisa and Daniel had been married for several years, and acquaintances perceived them as a calm, unremarkable couple. All the stranger looked the fact that Louisa found herself alone behind the wheel in the middle of the night, without any clear reason, and apparently without her spouse's knowledge. The police traffic accident report recorded an accident at the exit from Novgorod toward the country highway at approximately 1:45 in the morning on the 10th of February 2020. Louisa's car, an old silver Ford Focus, veered off the road and crashed into a pole at high speed. Louisa was taken to the hospital in serious condition, after which she became disabled. Her blood was completely free of alcohol, 0 per ml, which confirmed the examination of her sober state during the incident. However, investigators' attention was drawn to an important fact. Just 5 minutes before the accident, Louisa's mobile phone received a call from an unknown number. The call was the only one all evening, but remained unanswered. Who exactly called and for what reason could not be determined at that moment. The number remained unidentified. This detail was recorded but did not receive development immediately after the accident. The police simply attached a printout of the calls to the case materials without giving it special significance, although it could subsequently play a decisive role. During the first questioning after the accident, Louisa's parents told the police that their daughter had gone out at night to buy groceries. This explanation looked suspicious from the very beginning. Investigators quickly double-checked the facts. The supermarkets and stores closest to Louisa's house did not work after 11 p.m., which clearly contradicted the parents' words. Security camera checks confirmed that Louisa had indeed driven past several closed stores without even slowing down. Where she was actually heading remained completely unclear. Daniel was at home at this time, and according to him, was sleeping and did not know about her nighttime departure. His testimony coincided with the testimony of neighbors who claimed that it was quiet in the spouse's apartment that night. It seemed that the husband did not pay attention to Louisa's absence at all, at least until the call from the hospital. The investigation became interested in the unknown caller, whose call came directly before the accident. A version was put forward that the caller could be connected to the accident itself. Perhaps Louisa was trying to escape from someone or, conversely, was driving to someone on an urgent call. Call details were made, but the number belonged to an anonymous SIM card bought without registration or traces. It was not immediately possible to identify the caller, and investigators suggested that it could be someone from Louisa's circle whom she did not tell even close relatives about. This number was not listed in her contact list, and none of Louisa's acquaintances recognized this phone during subsequent questioning. A new, completely unclear line of investigation opened. Could this have been a stalker or a person who forced Louisa to leave home in the middle of the night? So far, this remained just a hypothesis, but an important one requiring verification. A few days after the accident, investigators discovered another strangeness that no one had initially paid attention to. During the inspection of Louisa's car, it turned out that her mobile phone had disappeared without a trace. It was not found either in the car interior, or at the scene of the incident, or at home, where police later arrived for additional inspection. Daniel assured that his wife's phone was always with her, and he had not seen it after the incident. The ambulance doctors also did not remember the phone being near Louisa at the time of hospitalization. This fact further complicated the situation, since the mobile device could have given answers to the main questions about the route, contacts, and motives of Louisa's night trip. The phone seemed to dissolve, as if someone had deliberately taken it or destroyed it after the accident. This detail again made investigators think about how accidental this accident was, and whether someone who did not want his connection with Louisa to become known was behind it. All this only strengthened suspicions and created grounds for further discoveries that could completely overturn the idea of what was happening in Louisa's life before her disability. The investigation had to go much deeper than it seemed at first. But now only one thing was clear. The key to the solution lay precisely in the disappeared phone and the unknown caller whose call remained unanswered. The investigation was going slowly until an unexpected event occurred that dramatically changed the picture of what was happening. On the morning of the 15th of January 2021, workers from the Novgorod Utilities Service began repairing sewage pipes in the basement of the house where the couple lived. One of the plumbers noticed something unusual among the dirt and garbage. It was an old Samsung Galaxy A50 smartphone from 2019, covered with a thick layer of dirt but surprisingly undamaged. The smartphone was located directly next to the sewage riser located exactly under Louisa and Daniel's apartment. The find caused immediate police interest. The phone was promptly transferred to experts, and soon confirmation came. The SIM card inside the device belonged to Louisa. Verification of the data preserved in memory quickly showed several key points that were previously unknown to the investigation. The most important discovery was the call logs. It turned out that on the night of the 15th of August 2020, Louisa repeatedly tried to call her husband. There were 5 outgoing calls to Daniel's number in the phone's memory. Each call lasted only a few seconds and remained unanswered. It was at this time that Louisa abruptly stopped leaving home, and her contacts with the outside world were reduced almost to zero. This fact required careful study and raised new questions for the police to Daniel that had not even arisen before. Daniel was called to the police and presented with the find. They showed him the phone, telling him exactly where it was discovered and what was contained in the device's memory. Daniel's reaction surprised even experienced investigators. He looked absolutely indifferent. He stated briefly and dryly, "I didn't know the phone was found," after which he fell silent and added nothing more. Daniel did not ask a single question about how the phone ended up under his apartment. He seemed to expect this information and did not consider it surprising or worthy of attention. The investigation recorded his silence and calmness in the protocol, noting this reaction as extremely strange and suspicious. Police immediately began working on several possible versions of how the phone appeared in the basement. One version was the assumption that someone from outside deliberately threw the device into the sewage riser to create an illusion of disappearance and hide traces. Such a version looked convincing, especially considering Daniel's behavior, who showed no surprise. It seemed as if the phone could have gotten there with the help of an outsider seeking to cover tracks or direct suspicion at the husband. This version was easy to believe, given the general course of the investigation, but there was no confirmation of it yet. A day after the phone was discovered, a digital data specialist completed the restoration of the device's contents and reported another crucial fact. Among the last files were photographs dated the 10th of December 2020. Several shots captured sheets with blood traces. The photographs looked random, taken in haste and poor lighting, but the blood traces on them were clearly visible. In addition, hands partially appeared in the photos, but it was still impossible to determine exactly who they belonged to. The expert noted that from the nature of the shots, only one thing was clear. They were taken by someone who was clearly in the apartment and probably experiencing stress or haste. The details visible in the photos matched the setting of Louisa and Daniel's bedroom. Now the investigation faced a completely new task: to understand who the hands captured in the photographs belonged to and under what circumstances these blood traces appeared. Until this moment, no one had even supposed that a situation so disturbing and important could have occurred in the spouse's apartment that Louisa considered it necessary to photograph it, especially since immediately after this, the phone was clearly thrown away by someone who wanted to get rid of possible evidence. The new discovery changed the approach to the investigation and forced investigators to completely reconsider everything that was known about the events of the last months of Louisa's life. Someone was clearly trying to hide the truth, but now the police had a real lead capable of revealing the true picture of events. The investigation was approaching a key moment, although clarity was still far away. On the 18th of January 2021, police discovered another important detail in Daniel's biography. It turned out that he voluntarily left his job exactly 1 week before the day when Louisa was no more. Daniel had worked as an engineer at a local enterprise for more than 8 years, and his decision to leave seemed strange to everyone who knew him professionally. Now investigators needed to understand how Daniel's dismissal was connected to what happened in the spouse's apartment a week later. During questioning of enterprise employees, it turned out that in recent months, Daniel constantly complained about a difficult financial situation, calling it an economic pit. He repeatedly told colleagues about growing debts that had already exceeded 700,000 rubles, about 8,000 euros. The enterprise's HR department records preserved an interview where Daniel mentioned that his financial obligations had become too heavy. Colleagues confirmed that he often looked depressed and avoided personal communication. Despite this, the dismissal was unexpected for everyone. Former colleagues were convinced that it was precisely the debts that forced him to drastically change his life and give up a stable income. Daniel was called for questioning again. When the investigator asked about the reason for leaving work, he answered briefly and simply, "Tired." Daniel gave no other explanations. To verify his words and behavior in the period after dismissal, the investigation studied internet provider logs. It soon became clear that in the last weeks before the tragedy, Daniel practically never left the house, spending 10 and more hours daily in an online game. The IP address and connection times completely confirmed his alibi. He was indeed at home. But this information was double-edged. Presence in the apartment did not exclude that he could see and know everything that was happening to Louisa while remaining completely indifferent. The next part of the investigation closed one of the early suspicions. Financial expertise showed that Louisa's social benefits, which Daniel regularly withdrew, were practically not spent. The money remained unused. It went neither to debt repayment, nor to household expenses, nor to buying medicines or food. As a result, the version about financial fraud, which seemed obvious earlier, was officially rejected. Money was not the motive for what was happening in the apartment, and bank accounts confirmed this. The debts were indeed large, but Daniel made no attempts to pay them off with Louisa's money. Experts were puzzled, observing how the funds simply lay idle without any use. Against the background of this new data, particular attention was drawn to the forensic examination of the apartment. Specialists studied the dust layer and other microelements that had accumulated in the spouse's bedroom. The results stunned even experienced investigators. The dust layer and remains of organic particles showed that the bed linen on Louisa's bed had not been changed for at least 4 months. The last time the linen was changed was in mid-September 2020. This finding directly indicated that any care for Louisa had ceased from that moment, and that her condition became completely ignored by her husband. Dust, dirt, traces of absence of hygiene. All this confirmed the complete abandonment of the bedroom. Daniel continued to stay at home, playing computer games, but paid absolutely no attention to what was happening in the neighboring room. Why he did not call a doctor or seek help remained unclear. However, investigators were not rushing to conclusions, clearly recording only one thing. The situation was even more complex and confusing than it appeared at the very beginning. Now the police understood only that Daniel clearly was not pursuing financial goals, and most likely was not motivated exclusively by debts. But his passivity and complete inaction over several months appeared inexplicable. This turned the investigation into an attempt to uncover deeply hidden personal motives of a person who seemed to consciously close his eyes to the deterioration of Louisa's condition. The investigation continued to move forward, leaving behind more and more questions and fewer clear answers. Experts and investigators understood that the next clue or next interrogation could prove decisive. Time passed and the police were certain of only one thing. They did not yet fully understand what kind of person was before them and what exactly he was hiding while playing online games, while his wife was losing the ability to move and receive help. The investigation seemed to gradually reach a dead end until suddenly a new witness appeared. Carmen, the couple's neighbor who had been avoiding communication with police until this moment, decided to break her silence. The woman told about events that could radically change the picture of what was happening in Louisa and Daniel's apartment back in August 2020. Then she first heard screams from the neighboring apartment, a distinct female voice, clearly belonging to Louisa. During verification of Carmen's testimony, police seized and studied the woman's correspondence in the WhatsApp messenger. The recovered messages clearly showed that on August 1st, 2020, Carmen wrote to a friend the phrase, "They are arguing again." The friend clarified who exactly was arguing, to which Carmen directly answered, "Neighbors, the woman, has been screaming for the second evening in a row." These messages were sent around 11:15 in the evening. Thus, the fact of conflict or some other event in Louisa's apartment was confirmed independently of Carmen's own words. The woman explained that she had not reported earlier because she did not want to interfere in other people's affairs, especially since the screaming stopped on its own after a few days. When investigators called Daniel to clarify details of the August events, he held himself confidently and coldly. The man admitted that during that period he indeed spent a lot of time at the computer, actively playing online games. To the investigators' question about screams and quarrels, he answered quickly and clearly. Those were just gaming emotions, nothing special. He stated that any sounds could have been caused precisely by his hobby and not by conflicts with his wife. However, Carmen's testimony completely contradicted Daniel's words. The woman confidently insisted that the voice she heard was precisely female, and the screams sounded distinct and clear. Those were not games. That was Louisa. Carmen was categorical and did not doubt her words. This put the investigation before a serious contradiction. Both sides insisted on their rightness, and each version required verification. Carmen's words and the presence of messages on her phone gave police reason to assume that in August 2020, physical violence could have occurred in Louisa's apartment. This assumption became a new important version of the investigation. Despite the fact that there was no medical data directly confirming this at that moment, the very possibility required careful verification. Investigators decided that it was necessary to check Louisa's medical records for August and September to establish whether she had sought help or hidden her condition. For now, this version remained open and required further study. 2 days after Carmen's testimony, police requested data from the management company of the house where Louisa and Daniel lived. Among the records, another strange detail was discovered that could relate to the August events. On August 3rd, 2020, one of the residents of the lower floor filed a complaint with the management company, reporting that water had been flowing from the spouse's balcony for several hours. Company workers came to the site and recorded a wet facade, but no longer found the problem itself. The apartment door was closed, no one answered the calls, and the incident was written off as tenant negligence. Now, police wondered whether the water leak could have been not an accident, but a deliberate attempt to hide or mask noise, screams, or traces of some event that occurred in the apartment. The time of filing the complaint suspiciously coincided with the dates indicated by Carmen in her correspondence. Suspicions only intensified. It became obvious that the August events required more detailed study and could become the key to solving the entire subsequent tragedy. Investigators began preparing requests to medical institutions, hoping to obtain accurate data about Louisa's condition during this period. They hoped that these documents could confirm or refute assumptions about violence that could have taken place in the couple's apartment long before Louisa stopped leaving home. Understanding the events of August 2020 now seemed vitally important in order to finally unravel the tangle of contradictions and strange circumstances surrounding the last months of Louise's life. On February 1st, 2021, the investigation unexpectedly received information that called into question the entire logic of events in the last months of Louise's life. Employees of a medical goods delivery service provided police with data about orders paid for by Daniel's bank card. In the list were special consumable materials for bedridden patients, disposable sheets, sanitary supplies, gloves. However, for a strange reason, the delivery address in these orders did not match the couple's apartment. All orders were delivered to an address on a completely different street, several kilometers from where Daniel and Louisa lived. This looked, to put it mildly, suspicious. Police called in for questioning the courier who regularly delivered these goods. The young man remembered the details well. The recipient of the orders was each time an elderly woman, whom he described in great detail. The woman never introduced herself, always received the order silently, asked no questions, and never passed parcels to anyone else. The courier never saw Daniel and never heard about him. The recipient was not registered at the specified address, and the residents of the house also did not know her. Her identity remained a mystery, and this circumstance required immediate verification by the investigation. When Daniel was called to the police again and presented with these facts, his answer was short and laconic. Got the address wrong. Investigators reminded him that there were 7 orders, and they came regularly, almost every week. 7 identical mistakes in a row seemed impossible, even accidentally. Moreover, Daniel did not answer why he did not pick up the orders himself, and why he never once notified social services or delivery services about this strange mistake. Police immediately noted this inconsistency, suspecting that behind the simple explanation lay a conscious decision. Simultaneously, the police completed the verification of the phone number from which Louise received the last call before the traffic accident in February 2020. The number led the investigation to that same elderly woman who was receiving medical supplies. It turned out this was a former nurse, an old friend of Louise's family. The woman calmly and confidently explained that she had indeed called Louise before the accident, simply wanting to know how she was doing. Her explanation seemed plausible, especially since the investigation had no other data about her connection to the tragedy. Thus, the version that Louise might have been pursued by an unknown caller was officially closed. However, the interrogation of the nurse did not end there. The woman confessed to another important fact that she had kept secret until now. In August 2020, after Louise had practically stopped leaving the house, she called Daniel and directly recommended that he seek medical help and even insisted on Louise's hospitalization. Louise's condition worried her, and as a specialist with experience, she saw the need for professional care. Daniel's reaction to her suggestion was sharp and categorical. He immediately refused, stating that he had everything under control and did not need help. Now the investigation was opening a new, even darker side of Daniel's behavior. He was not simply avoiding medical help for his wife. He was consciously refusing it, even when it was offered by close ones and specialists. Combined with the orders for supplies that never made it to the apartment, this looked strange and suspicious. The investigators once again wondered what motives were actually driving the man. Clarity was becoming increasingly elusive, and Daniel's actions increasingly mysterious. The facts indicated that he understood how serious Louise's condition was, but at the same time purposefully avoided the intervention of outsiders. The investigation noted this detail as key and decided to concentrate specifically on it in subsequent steps of the investigation. The police officially recorded the new testimony, intending to find out what specific reasons forced Daniel to behave so strangely and hide the true state of affairs. The answers to these questions could become a turning point in the investigation and provide the key to understanding what was actually happening in the couple's apartment. By mid-February, the investigation began to understand that the key to the events lay not only in facts, but also in Daniel's personality itself. Why could a man who had previously aroused no suspicion from those around him consciously turn a blind eye to his own wife's deteriorating condition? The answers lay in the psychological portrait of the suspect, which experts presented to the police on the morning of the 10th of February 2021. The conclusion stated, signs of deep emotional burnout and severe depression. But do they justify what happened? To understand what was going on in Daniel's head, the investigation requested logs from gaming chats where the suspect spent most of his time from autumn 2020. In the correspondence from December 2020, disturbing messages sent by him to other players were found. Among the phrases were such as, "Want to disappear," "There's no point anymore," "Everything around is too complicated." Such messages appeared regularly, sometimes several times a day. The dry and impartial language of the investigation reports left no room for emotions, but indicated clear signs of the suspect's unstable mental state. This was confirmed by an independent psychological examination, although it did not itself remove questions about the motives of his behavior. A new detail surfaced during the standard procedure of checking the couple's property. Notarial documents officially entered in the registry confirmed that exactly 1 month before the tragedy, Daniel transferred the apartment belonging to him to his father. When investigators asked Daniel about the reasons for such a decision, he answered calmly and briefly, "It was necessary." He did not delve into details, showed no excitement, and did not ask a single counter-question. It seemed he was completely indifferent to what conclusions the investigation would draw from this information. The documents were absolutely legal, and the fact of the property transfer to the suspect's father's name was recorded officially. But why Daniel needed this precisely during that period remained unclear. These circumstances gave reason for the emergence of a new version of the investigation, which at first glance seemed plausible. Perhaps Daniel was planning to settle accounts with life. The property transfer, depressive messages in gaming chats, everything pointed to potential preparation for such an outcome. This version could explain why the man so demonstratively showed no care for Louise and found himself in isolation. However, the police was not yet making final conclusions, leaving this version at the stage of a working hypothesis. It was convenient, but too superficial, and the investigators understood that this could be merely an attempt by the suspect to divert attention from his real responsibility. On the same day, the forensic doctor transmitted to the investigation a preliminary conclusion that once again returned attention to the main line of accusation. According to medical conclusions, the causes of what happened to Louise were 100% preventable with minimal care and timely seeking of medical help. The doctor emphasized, any person, even without medical knowledge, could have noticed Louise's critical condition and called for help. Forensic medicine dryly and unambiguously indicated a direct connection between inaction and consequences. Now the investigation only had to finally establish: were Daniel's actions the result of his psychological problems and depression, or did they hide conscious, cold calculation? His emotions and mental state seemed able to explain much, but in no way justified what happened. The investigation understood that it was one step away from final proof of the suspect's intent, and this became an absolute priority for subsequent actions. The police allowed themselves neither sympathy nor pity. Daniel appeared in their eyes as a person whose actions did not evoke an emotional response. The dry language of examinations and documents painted a picture of a person immersed in himself and completely detached from reality. Now it was necessary to understand how consciously he allowed the tragedy, and this understanding was to become the point in the investigation after which there would no longer be doubts about his true role. One last step remained for the investigation to establish the truth. The psychological state of the suspect only added complications but did not remove guilt from him. The facts collected at this stage were extremely convincing, and the investigators were confident. The true picture of what happened would be revealed very soon. By the 15th of September 2020, Louise was under official supervision of medical workers at home. Her medical record stated, 3 nurse visits per week were mandatory to maintain the woman's stable condition after the accident. But from this date, suddenly all visits stopped. The investigators had to find out what caused the sudden and inexplicable interruption of medical care and who made this fateful decision. The investigation requested data from the insurance company that paid for Louise's home medical care. In response came a document containing a written refusal to continue services, dated precisely the 15th of September 2020. The document was signed with Louise's own name. The insurance company confirmed that they had received the original application by mail and had not suspected anything unusual, as the signature was similar to other official documents from Louise. At first glance, everything looked legal, but the investigation was not yet rushing to draw conclusions, awaiting the final conclusion of the handwriting expert. Neighbor Carmen, a witness who had previously given testimony about screams from the couple's apartment, was questioned again. This time her testimony supplemented the picture of events. Carmen confirmed that precisely on the night of the refusal of medical services, she saw Daniel at the garbage container in the courtyard of the house. The man was throwing away several large black bags that looked like medical waste, medication packaging, used gloves, bandages. Carmen did not attach significance to this at that moment and did not tell anyone, as she was not aware that the medical services had ceased. Now, her memories looked more than important and pointed to Daniel's conscious decision to get rid of medical supplies. A few days later came the conclusion of the forensic handwriting expert. The conclusion clearly stated, Louise's signature on the document refusing medical care had been forged personally by Daniel. The forgery was executed so neatly that it seemed genuine to the insurance company employees. This fact finally destroyed the version of physical violence that had arisen earlier during the investigation. Now the investigation clearly recorded the fact of conscious termination of care for Louise, transferring Daniel's actions to the category of criminal inaction with elements of clear intent. What initially might have seemed like a confluence of circumstances acquired a completely different criminal shade. But this was not yet the end of the shocking discoveries. The investigation requested video surveillance recordings from the nearest supermarket where the couple usually did their shopping. The obtained recordings caused investigators bewilderment bordering on disgust. It turned out that during the last month before Louise's death, Daniel visited the store exactly once a week, and each time bought only one bottle of drinking water with a volume of 1.5 liters. The last such purchase was made one day before Louise passed away. Daniel did not acquire any other food or essential items. The recordings clearly documented each of his purchases, emphasizing the scale of absolute neglect and even cruelty. It became obvious that the refusal of medical care and neglect of Louise's basic needs were conscious and consistent actions directed against her health and life. The investigation only had to legally qualify Daniel's actions, but even now it was obvious that the investigation was one step away from the final verdict. The police maintained a strict and impartial tone, but the facts spoke for themselves. Before the investigation stood a person who consciously and systematically created conditions incompatible with normal life. The motives for his actions were the subject of further proceedings, but the fact of criminal inaction transitioning into intent was already obvious. The investigation did not doubt that decisive events would occur in the coming days that would allow the case to be finally closed and charges to be filed. But for now, the police continued working to build a flawless legal construction against Daniel, relying on dry and indisputable evidence. By mid-March, the investigation was nearing its end, and it seemed that the investigation already knew everything about Daniel's actions. But at the moment when the case was almost transferred to court, retired neighbor Pablo came to the police department, previously considered an insignificant witness and long removed from the list of active figures in the case. He silently placed an old flash drive on the investigator's table and said that it contained recordings from the entrance video recorder made from August 2020 to January 2021. These recordings could become the last and final evidence against Daniel. Studying the recordings took several days, but the results turned out to be stunning in their simplicity and cruelty. The camera installed above the entrance door of the building recorded absolutely all entrances and exits of residents, including Daniel. According to the video materials, the suspect left the apartment on average no more than twice a week, always briefly, and most importantly, never returned with bags of groceries or other items necessary for caring for a bedridden person. Moreover, all of Daniel's exits were clearly recorded by days and hours, completely excluding the possibility of secret or unregistered visits by delivery services or outsiders. In court, Daniel's lawyers tried to dispute these recordings, claiming that all necessary products and medications were regularly delivered by courier services, and therefore the video does not show Daniel bringing anything home. However, the investigation already had data from all major courier services in the city obtained back in February. This data categorically refuted the defense's claims. Not a single courier delivery registered a single order to the address of Louise and Daniel's apartment for the period from August 2020 to January 2021. The video recorder recordings confirmed that there were indeed no courier visits. The defense found itself in a difficult position, and this argument was quickly rejected by the court. Also at this stage, the investigation received the conclusion of a forensic psychiatrist regarding Daniel's condition. The expert's conclusion was unambiguous and clear. The suspect is fully sane. No signs of psychological deviations excluding responsibility for actions were found. Moreover, the psychiatrist directly indicated that the version about possible preparation of the suspect for suicide has no basis. The investigation officially closed this false lead, finally focusing on Daniel's criminal inaction as the main version of the case. But at the moment when it seemed that the verdict was already practically delivered, the defense made a completely unexpected and extremely controversial step. In court, Daniel's lawyer suddenly declared that Louise allegedly herself asked her husband not to prolong her suffering. The defense provided not a single written or audio evidence, only an oral statement by Daniel himself, who insisted that this was Louise's last will. The courtroom fell into heavy silence when the defense made a bet on this argument, understanding that the investigation has no direct evidence refuting such words. This could complicate the judicial process, creating emotional resonance and casting doubt on the motives of Daniel's behavior. The investigation understood that this unexpected argument of the defense required clear refutation, which could only be obtained with final exposure at the court hearing. Now, the prosecution needed to prepare for the decisive stage of the process to unambiguously prove that Daniel's words were merely an attempt to avoid responsibility and not his wife's real desire. However, even in the absence of written evidence, the prosecution had a mass of indirect but convincing evidence showing Daniel's systematic and conscious inaction that led to tragedy. The judicial process entered the final phase, where every word, every testimony, and every piece of evidence had decisive significance for the outcome of the case. Now it remained to wait for the last hearing, at which the investigation was to fully expose the suspect and prove his true motives. Justice was at stake, and the finale was already close. The courtroom is full. On the 10th of April 2021, in this quiet and cool room on Justice Street in Novgorod, the hearing of one of the strangest and most confusing cases of recent years concludes. The judge stands and reads the final ruling. The accused Daniel is found guilty of intentionally causing Louise's death, his wife, through conscious and consistent inaction. The court established that Daniel stopped medical care for Louise, personally forged her signature on official documents, hid what was happening in the apartment from neighbors, and deliberately misled social services, creating an appearance of well-being. The acts are qualified under Article 138 of the Spanish Criminal Code, murder through criminal inaction. In the court materials, experts completely excluded the version of natural death. The autopsy and forensic medical examination of the 20th of January 2021 proved that the only cause of what happened was severe exhaustion and infected bed sores. Forensic doctors confidently stated, minimal medical care could have completely prevented the tragedy. Analysis of financial data revealed that for several months, Daniel regularly withdrew social payments intended for Louise, but did not use them for their intended purpose. The money was not spent on medicines, food, or medical supplies and simply lay in the apartment. Louise's signature on documents cancelling regular nurse care was unconditionally recognized as forged by graphological expertise. The results of this expertise became a key element of the accusation and confirmation of Daniel's conscious actions. Video materials and data from digital surveillance systems also fully confirmed the prosecution's version. Care was minimal, products were practically not purchased, delivery services were not used at all. These circumstances made the defense's arguments untenable and completely shattered in the court hearing. When the judge began reading the final lines of the verdict, Daniel unexpectedly broke his silence and loudly addressed the hall, trying to shift blame onto social services and city structures, which allegedly did not provide proper care for Louise. But his words were instantly interrupted by the judge's voice, who reminded the accused that all responsibility for what happened lay exclusively with him. The judge's voice sounded dry, confident, and without emotions. A short pause followed, after which the final punishment was announced. Daniel is sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. The verdict sounded clear and unambiguous, without explanations and unnecessary comments. Daniel fell silent, not uttering another word. Court bailiffs approached the accused and without any emotions on their faces led him out of the hall. The door closed behind them. The hum in the hall died down. Microphones were turned off, and the silence became absolute. Thus ended the story that kept the city's residents and investigators in suspense for several months in a row. Now, upon completion of this case, investigators could confidently say that it was established and confirmed completely that the mechanism of what happened to Louise is fully revealed and raises no doubts. False versions that could confuse the investigation about the mysterious caregiver, unknown pursuer, and supposed self-destruction of Daniel himself were finally closed and completely excluded. And legal qualification of the accused's actions is determined finally and without the right to revision. But even after the trial, one circumstance remained that is still not officially disclosed and will probably forever remain classified as unknown. The reasons why Daniel never once sought medical help and consciously chose the path of complete inaction remained his personal secret. The investigation and court were able to prove the very fact of the crime, but not the motives that guided Daniel. Why he did not take the simplest step and did not allow Louise to receive help, no one explained. This part of the story remains hidden and perhaps will forever remain without an answer. The last session is completed. The story of case number 4821-2021 is officially closed and transferred to the archive of judicial decisions of the city of Novgorod. No one will speak loudly about this case anymore, but it will remain a vivid and alarming page in the chronicle of Spain's judicial practice, reminding everyone who studies it how thin the line is between inaction and crime. Louise's story is finished, but the memory of her will continue to live in archives and documents to which, perhaps, they will return again someday. In the spring of 2023, a small forest fire near the tiny village of Holmsveden in central Sweden attracted the attention of local rescue services. What seemed like an ordinary natural incident led to a discovery that shook the entire country. Between burned grass and charred tree trunks, the firefighters accidentally noticed something strange. Burned boards, skillfully hidden under a sod. Beneath this was revealed what would later officially be called a jordkällare, an old earth cellar, roughly hewn into the ground and reinforced with tree trunks, 3 by 2 meters in size and somewhat more than 2 meters deep. When the fire was completely extinguished and the area cleared of smoke, the first response team descended. After just a few minutes, it became clear. This old abandoned cellar preserved not only forgotten utensils of the local farmers. Here, between dirt and soot, human remains were discovered on the damp floor. The first days of investigation brought incredible results. Crime technicians who examined the jordkällare officially documented the discovery of 42 burned skulls. Some of them were partially damaged by the fire, others almost completely intact, preserved under a layer of earth. Beside them lay several pairs of burned boots of different sizes. On some barely visible leather fragments were preserved. Here the investigation encountered its first serious difficulty. Inside the shoes and on individual leather pieces, leather labels with initials were preserved, but the complete names of the owners of many items could not be determined. Some initials did not match any name on the lists of officially missing persons. The forensic examination in the Cellar also brought to light more concrete evidence. Inside the lid of a wooden hatch, the crime technicians found a fragment of a chain from a Husqvarna forestry chainsaw, whose marking indicated a series from the year 1976. This was an important detail. There were only very few owners of such chains in the region. The circle of suspects immediately narrowed to a few people. On the same lid was a clear boot print, size 43, presumably a men's shoe. This was the only really clear clue that led to the presumed perpetrator, or possibly to a witness of the events. Already in the initial phase of the investigation, it became clear that the examination faced an incredibly complex task. The first suspicions were directed against the local poachers who were known in the area as the Elk. A group of poachers who had been causing trouble in the forests around the village of Holmsveden since the mid-70s had a bad reputation. They were suspected not only of illegal hunting, but also of regular threats against residents who disturbed their activities. This version seemed realistic and logical. The Elk had access to the necessary equipment, including chainsaws. But almost simultaneously, another version emerged that looked no less convincing. In the year 1978, when the first missing person cases were registered in this area, the father of one of the first missing children drew the investigators' attention. Emil, a 7-year-old boy who disappeared in July 1978 near the Sörgården stream. A man named Gunnar was long in the focus of the police. Some villagers mentioned in their statements that he behaved strangely, avoided contact with others, and became aggressive when it came to his son. The version about Gunnar received unexpected support after the investigators found an old amateur film in 8mm format that had been shot by residents in the summer of 1978. In the recordings of the short film, the same Gunnar could be clearly seen standing by the stream and apparently explaining something to two smaller figures whose faces could not be recognized. The film suddenly broke off, as if the cameraman had intentionally stopped the recording. The recording was blurry but sufficient to conclude. The man was obviously trying to lead those he was talking to deeper into the forest. For almost 2 weeks, the investigation pursued this version, but it proved to be false. It turned out that those who were considered missing were not visible in the film. The names of the people in the recordings were confirmed by their relatives living in the village. Gunnar was cleared of suspicion, but valuable time was lost, and the investigation again faced a wall of the unknown. 1 month after the beginning of the investigation, when it seemed that the examination was stuck in a dead end, a small, worn notebook was found not far from the Cellar, almost completely hidden in tall grass. On its rain-soaked pages, the investigators could decipher only a single line written in a foreign, hasty handwriting, so that the spirits of the forest remain silent. The note immediately triggered a new wave of speculation, but the author of these words remained unknown for the time being. Thus ended the first phase of the investigation. But it was precisely this strange and ominous note that became the bridge to the next discoveries. One thing was clear: the person who had written this knew much more than the others. And perhaps it was precisely this person who possessed the key to all the secrets that had remained silent for more than 40 years. Now, the investigation prepared for a completely new phase, in which one had to return to the past and carefully examine every detail of what had happened once more, including the chainsaw chain, the shoe print, and this strange diary. The truth was near, but no one could see it to the end. On the 20th of July 1978, one day after the first missing person cases in the forest near Holmsveden, the residents gathered in the Lappkullen parking lot. The investigators questioned possible witnesses and those who had last seen the missing persons. Åke Lundgren, the father of missing Emil, behaved surprisingly composed. In his behavior, there was no panic. He spoke confidently and briefly. They are playing somewhere. They will come back. Where should they go? Such composure irritated and confused at the same time. A person could not be so cold-blooded in such a situation. The investigators looked at each other and silently noted every one of his words, every one of his gestures. Something here was obviously not right. In conversation with the police, Åke clearly explained his alibi. According to his words, on the afternoon of the 19th of July, about half an hour before the disappearance, he was picking berries about 1 kilometer north of the camp, not far from the stream bed of Sørgården. A check of the route confirmed that the path would not have taken more than 15 minutes. Time and distance matched, but an important point that caught the attention of the criminalists. Lundgren's old, worn backpack was tied with a special knot known among the locals as a fisherman's loop. Exactly the same knot was used on a piece of rope that was discovered 45 years later in the Rådkellare. In itself, this fact was weak, but exactly such small details could indicate something more serious. To the obvious question from the police about why Åke had not heard screams or sounds during the disappearance, the man again answered absolutely calmly and simply. The Sørgården stream rushes particularly strongly in summer. The children had gone ahead a bit. Quite explainable and seemingly logical, but the investigators looked at each other suspiciously. Could the rushing of the stream be so loud that it completely drowned out the voices? The question remained open, but Åke looked the investigators confidently in the eyes, as if he were ready to repeat this 1,000 times. On the evening of the same day, after receiving search warrant number 487 from the 20th/7th, 1978 for Lundgren's garage and house, the police drove to his residence on the edge of the village. The search of the premises brought an unexpected result. The garage, clad with boards and smelling of moisture and machine oil, was literally strewn with hunting trophies. Deer antlers, dried pelts, and animal skulls that stood on shelves and hung on the walls. On the table lay a set of butcher knives. On the shelves beside them lay neatly rusted fishing equipment and fishing nets with the same knots. At first glance, the room of a man with strange inclinations. The investigators even exchanged tense glances. But checking the hunting license and questioning the neighbors quickly dispelled the doubts. Åke was a hunter and fisherman known in the area who had been collecting trophies since his youth. The false trail was immediately discarded. It was simply the room of a man obsessed with his hobby. Late in the evening of the 20th of July, the police received information from a tourist who had coincidentally been in the Lappkullen parking lot the day before at exactly 17 o'clock. This witness, Hans Eriksson, stated with certainty he had personally seen how Åke Lundgren was walking around the parking lot at the specified time asking passing people if they had seen the 2 missing boys. This statement contradicted Lundgren's alibi, who claimed to still be berry picking at that time, 1 kilometer north of the parking lot. This obvious time discrepancy made the investigators very suspicious. Someone was obviously hiding something. Either the tourist had confused the time, or Åke himself was not telling the whole truth. The investigations continued. The tourist's statement prompted the police to recheck Lundgren's route. They wanted to carefully measure time and distance to understand whether it was possible to be in 2 places almost simultaneously at the right time. The next step of the investigations was to either definitively exclude the suspect from the circle of suspects or solidify him as a key figure. In the spring of 1993, the village of Holmsveden once again came into the focus of investigators. On the 2nd of May, around 3 o'clock in the morning, Elsa Karlsdotter disappeared. At first glance, the circumstances seemed completely inexplicable. The girl's bedroom was empty, the window stood slightly open, and barely visible barefoot footprints were discovered in the yard. The family behaved suspiciously and strangely, avoided direct looks from the investigators, and constantly exchanged glances with each other. It was obvious that they were hiding something. but the police did not yet understand what exactly. Several hours after the search began, it became clear that there was another puzzle in this case. At dawn, the investigators carefully examined the area around the house. The moist earth had preserved traces of naked feet that led into the dense forest toward the northwest, in the direction of an abandoned hunting cabin that had not been used by anyone for a long time. The path was clear and confident, as if Elsa knew exactly where she was going. However, none of the locals could remember the girl ever having visited this place before. Elsa's older brother, 17-year-old David Karlsdotter, informed the police with noticeable concern in his voice that he had awakened in the night from an inexplicable unrest and had seen in the window the weak flickering of a distant lantern deep in the forest. When the investigators asked why he had not immediately told anyone about it, David answered evasively and fell silent, his gaze lowered to the ground. The parents were also not entirely open and only quietly added that Elsa was sometimes strange at night. Later, the investigation found out that the family had long concealed an important detail. Elsa suffered from sleepwalking, regularly left the house at night, and moved without being conscious of it. The key question of the investigations was whether Elsa could go so far into the forest at night without waking up. The distance to the cabin was almost 3 kilometers. The air temperature dropped to plus 6 degrees Celsius at night, and the terrain was impassable and difficult to traverse. The experts agreed. The probability that the girl could cover such a path in an unconscious state and remain uninjured was extremely low. However, the family continued to insist that Elsa could have gone away exactly like that. They persisted that sleepwalking episodes occurred regularly with her, and the parents were certain that this was just another case. The investigators recorded these statements but remained convinced that more was at play here. On the same day, around noon, a search group discovered on the shore of a local stream a coat known to many locals that belonged to older brother David. The coat lay by the water, neatly folded, as if someone had consciously left it in a clearly visible spot. At first glance, this looked suspicious. Why was the coat here, and why was it taken off in the forest? The police briefly returned to the version that David might be hiding something important, or even be involved in Elsa's disappearance. However, when David was summoned for renewed questioning, he calmly explained that he had left the coat on the shore the day before when he had gone fishing with friends. Witnesses confirmed his words and described the details of the previous day in detail. The coat proved not to be evidence but a coincidence that distracted the investigations for several hours. The version with the brother was set aside but not definitively closed. The search was continued toward evening of the same day. A police dog handler with a tracking dog moved slowly and concentratedly, paying careful attention to the animal's reaction. The dog confidently followed Elsa's tracks and persistently led the group to that abandoned hunting cabin to which the strange barefoot tracks led. When the investigation group finally reached the cabin, everyone froze, struck by the sudden realization. It was exactly the same cabin that the investigators already knew about from the files of the distant year 1978. Exactly here, 15 years earlier, they had already searched for missing persons. The cabin had looked abandoned for a long time. Peeling paint, rotten boards, covered with moss, and a crooked door. From the outside, nothing indicated the presence of anyone inside, but the dog persistently pulled on the leash toward the closed door. The investigator carefully touched the handle, opened the door a crack, and looked inside. Inside, the cabin was empty. Only fresh mud traces could be seen on the floor, as if someone had recently passed through here. It clearly smelled damp from here, but no traces of Elsa were found inside. Now it became clear to the investigators that exactly this abandoned cabin was the key point in the case of the missing persons. The police contacted the local archive and requested the materials of the old case from 1978 to find out who had lived in this cabin 20 years ago and what connected this place with the new missing person cases. Before them lay a long path. The police had to connect two puzzles separated by 15 years to understand who and why returns to this place forgotten by all. So far, the investigators had only strange coincidences: barefoot tracks, the girl's hidden illness, and an unknown lantern in the night in their hands. But now it was clear to them that an important secret was hidden in this cabin that could shed light on the events of the distant past and the most recent present. On the 16th of June 2005, a new detail suddenly emerged in the case of the mysterious disappearances in the forests near Holmsveden. On this day, ornithologist and volunteer Birgitta Holm made her usual round in the local forests and noted observations in her field diary. When she looked through her notes in the evening, her gaze fell on a strange note that she had made almost automatically along the way. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, a short elderly man was noticed leading a small figure toward the swampy terrain. This observation immediately attracted the investigators' attention. The investigation group urgently drove to Birgitta to clarify all details. During the conversation with the investigators, Birgitta described the events in detail and showed her diary. In it, beside the text note, there was also a small but clear sketch. On the paper was depicted the silhouette of an unknown person, hidden under a wide storm jacket with a hood that completely covered the face. Special attention was paid to the legs, large, massive boots of approximately size 43. The shoe size immediately made the investigators suspicious. A similar footprint had been discovered many years earlier, in the year 2023, in the Jordkellar. An inspection of the forest path where Birgitta had seen the figures was immediately organized. The search was successful. About 300 meters from the main road, a small clay pipe was found on the ground, obviously old, with a characteristic pattern and a shape that was widespread in the mid-1970s. Such a pipe was on the list of objects that had disappeared together with Elsa Karlsdotter in the year 1993. This was the first direct clue that connected the missing person cases of different years. The investigators immediately asked Birgitta the obvious question: could she have mistaken the unknown person for one of the forest patrol employees or the local rangers who regularly inspected the area? Birgitta's answer was clear and confident. The rangers always wore jackets of completely different color and shape, and moreover, she had specifically inquired at the park administration the day before. No rounds were taking place on this day. This clearly ruled out the version with official forest workers and confirmed the presence of an unknown foreign person in the forest. Based on the description of the boots and the appearance, the police began checking residents whose lifestyle suggested frequent stays in the forest. They quickly came across the charcoal burner Lars Rautiainen, who lived on the edge of Holmsveden and was regularly in the forests to burn charcoal for sale. Lars completely matched the description. Short in stature, often wore an old storm jacket with a hood and heavy boots. His lifestyle and his withdrawn character aroused additional suspicion among the police. With permission from the local court, the police conducted a search of Lars's house. All rooms, the shed and the property around the house were carefully searched, but no direct evidence was found. Lars himself calmly confirmed that he had indeed owned such boots, but insisted that he had already sold them in the year 1898 to a local hunter who urgently needed sturdy shoes for the forest. Initially, this information seemed doubtful, but a few hours later the documents of a local commission shop confirmed Lars's words. The boots described by Birgitta had indeed been sold 7 years earlier, in the year 1898. The false trail to the charcoal burner Lars Rautiainen was provisionally marked as such. That same evening, the investigation group received the archived inventory records of the shop, which confirmed that the charcoal burner had indeed sold the shoes. However, for some reason, the buyer's name was missing from the records. In its place was only a short note from the seller. Buyer, Forestry Company. This was an extremely unexpected turn that directed the investigation in a completely different direction. Now, the investigators faced the question of who exactly among the employees of the forestry company could have acquired the boots with this characteristic size and cut, and for what purpose. The investigation decided to comb through the archive documents from the 1970s and check in detail every single employee of the forestry company who had any connection whatsoever to these locations. The staff carefully examined the work journals, the personnel files of the employees and their movements to find even the slightest clue that could lead to a person who might be involved in the events. In the hands of the police were Birgitte's sketch, an old children's whistle, boots whose trail had appeared in the case since 1978, and above all, the feeling that they were approaching the answer to the question for the first time of who was behind the mystery of the missing persons cases that had troubled the residents of Holmsveden for decades. The story was gradually taking shape, although it was still far from complete clarity. The next steps were to clarify who exactly was behind the figure of the mysterious stranger who hid behind a hood and heavy forest boots and appeared again and again in this story. On the 12th of August 2010, the investigation group returned once again to Lars Rautiainen, the charcoal burner from Holmsveden who had remained on the sidelines of the investigation the whole time. The occasion was the discovery of a strange collection in his old abandoned hut. Along the walls of the room, dozens of deer skulls with huge antlers were neatly lined up. Such a collection seemed disturbing, especially given the earlier moments of suspicion and the circumstances of the previous missing persons cases. It was decided to check Rautiainen once more, as thoroughly as possible. The police officers conducted another search of Lars's hut, paying special attention to details. Here they found several coiled ropes that resembled those that had been found before. However, the examination immediately pointed to differences. The knots were different, and the diameter of the ropes was exactly 8 millimeters, quite different from those in the Jord Kellerer. The police also carefully checked Lars's personal records and his handwriting samples. The graphological expert opinion was clear. The diary found near the Jord Kellerer with the sentence about the spirits of the forest had not been written by Lars. The handwritings did not match even remotely. This further strengthened the investigators' doubts, although it did not completely eliminate the moments of suspicion. The next important step was a DNA analysis. Lars calmly agreed to provide a sample without offering any resistance. After 3 days, the results completely cleared the suspicions against him. His genetic profile did not match any of the samples that had been collected at the crime scenes before. The police recorded this fact and temporarily concentrated on other trails. The investigators asked themselves the question, does the cut of the found rope match the knife confiscated from Lars? A forensic examination conducted on site revealed that the cut differed greatly. The charcoal burner used a specific, slightly dull knife for woodworking that left characteristic notches. The rope from the Jord Kellerer, on the other hand, was cut cleanly and straight, as if it had been cut with a professional, well-maintained forest knife. This difference was obvious and convincing enough to exclude Lars in this line of investigation as well. But at the most unexpected moment, the investigators discovered something strange in an earth pit on Lars's property. A small, heavily rusted children's button with an unusual pattern. For a moment, this discovery caused excitement among the police officers. But soon, the forensic laboratory provided the conclusion that the button had been manufactured as early as the 1950s, long before the first missing persons cases in Holmsveden. The experts suspected that it could have gotten there completely by chance, brought in many years ago with soil or garbage. The false trail with the button was closed. All the information collected about Lars Rautiainen confirmed that he was an unusual person who lived outside society and preferred solitude in the forest, but was in no way connected to the missing persons cases. Lars's status was officially closed. But on the evening of that same day, the investigation made an important leap forward. A police investigator from Holmsveden received documents from the Forest Administration archive with a list of employees who had received Husqvarna brand chainsaw chains in the year 1976. This list included exactly 12 names. For the first time in many years, there was a real possibility of getting on the trail of whoever had used the chain discovered in the Jord Kellerer in the year 2023. The documents were immediately forwarded to the analysis group, which began checking each of the 12 foresters for matches regarding place of residence and possible proximity to the abandoned hut that played a role in the cases of 1978 and 1993. At this moment, the investigation felt how the circle of suspects became truly narrow and concrete for the first time. The investigators decided to examine in detail all addresses of the 12 foresters on the list and reconstruct their movements in the 70s and 80s as precisely as possible. The police wanted to request old maps, work journals, witness statements from colleagues and neighbors to exclude or confirm each individual's involvement. The focus of the investigations now shifted completely to the employees of the Forest Administration, among whom possibly hid the one who had remained unnoticed for decades but had always been nearby. Each name on the list was now checked with the utmost precision, and the investigation recognized that among these 12 names hid a person who had kept a small region of Sweden in suspense for almost half a century. There was literally only one step left to the solution. On the 4th of July 2015, another disappearance occurred near Holmsveden. This time, Maja Hansen disappeared, a 12-year-old scout who was camping with a group from a neighboring region. From the first hours of the investigation, the investigators understood that the scout leader, Åsa Björklund, was obviously trying to hide some details. He avoided direct answers, was nervous, got confused, but finally admitted. The group had deviated from the official, approved path and turned into the forest for a secret adventure. Such unofficial routes were strictly forbidden in the area because of the lack of mobile phone reception. This confession was the first step toward uncovering an important detail that the investigation had not previously considered. During the questioning of one of the scouts, 12-year-old Per Holm, a new detail emerged. The boy remembered that shortly before Maja's disappearance, a strange stranger had appeared near their stopping point. He described an older man in a green parka with a slightly bent posture, who stood at the forest edge and called to them to come to him. Per clearly remembered that the stranger said with a strong accent characteristic of southern Norrbotten, "Come, I'll show you how to feed elk." This sentence immediately made the investigators suspicious. It had already fallen in witness statements about other missing persons cases before. This could not be a coincidence. Someone was repeating the same method again to lure others. The suspicion arose that this person could be one of the local hunters. After checking this variant, however, it turned out that no hunter working in the region had ever spoken with such an accent. Furthermore, none of the local reserve employees conducted control rounds that day and could not have been seen near the scout group. Thus, the hunter version was practically immediately excluded. This meant that a stranger, unknown to the locals, had approached the scout group. Meanwhile, the police concentrated on the person of the group leader, Åsa Björklund. The question was raised why he had led the scout group out of the zone without mobile phone reception at all, without informing anyone from the local services. Some police officers immediately suspected that such behavior could not be accidental. The leader might have had personal motives or even been connected to Maja's disappearance. However, Åsa proved to be an experienced educator who was well known in the local community and had no criminal past. After a careful review of his reputation and personal history, the investigation concluded that his actions were only a stupid mistake. He was provisionally removed from the list of suspects, and the investigation returned to examining other directions. The next important clue surfaced completely unexpectedly when the investigation team gained access to archive materials from Naturvårdsverket, the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. Among the numerous documents, a report was discovered about a forester who had worked in this sector as early as the late 70s. An important detail was noted in the report. The forester came from the region of southern Norrbotten and spoke a characteristic dialect that matched Per Holm's description. This find changed the entire course of the investigation. For the first time, there was a clear connection between a person from old archives and the current missing person cases. Someone was using the same lure phrase about feeding elk as almost 40 years ago. Now it became clear that this forester was not a random figure, but the one the police had been searching for all these years. Now the investigation faced the task of checking all information about this forester from the archive documents as quickly and in detail as possible. It had to be determined whether he was still alive, where he was now located, and whether he had any relationship to the missing person cases of recent decades. The investigation moved to the next phase, matching archive data, the list of 12 foresters who had received Husqvarna chains in 1976, and the identity of this mysterious man whose characteristic dialect and strange phrase had repeated itself over several decades in the forests of Holmsveden. It was obvious that the police had come very close to solving one of the darkest secrets in the history of this region. On the 13th of May 2023, 2 days after opening the root cellar in the forests of Holmsveden, the investigators discovered a new location that could provide answers to the questions that had tormented everyone for decades. 300 meters from the main discovery site in a swampy section of the forest massif, an old overgrown tar pit was found. The first excavations immediately brought a terrible discovery to light. At the bottom of the pit lay 18 human molars. This find meant that the number of confirmed victims had risen drastically. The experts immediately began examining the remains. Despite the long stay in the peat layer, the condition of the teeth enabled the experts to successfully extract DNA samples. Laboratory tests clearly confirmed that the teeth belonged to persons who had been officially reported missing between 1999 and 2012. This was an important addition to the already existing case files. During further excavations, the forensic technicians found another object that immediately drew the investigators' attention. Deep in the peat, a small, heavily oxidized copper gudgeon from a boat rope was discovered, a characteristic detail typical of boats from forestry operations from the 1940s. At first glance, the detail seemed too old to be connected to the events of recent decades, but the investigators decided to thoroughly check its origin in light of the previous finds. The question arose of what relationship the old copper gudgeon had to the crimes of recent years. After consultation with experts, it became known that exactly such parts were used by foresters for their workboats, which were intended for transporting floated tree logs on rivers and streams. Such gudgeons were extremely robust, durable, and could remain in functional condition for decades after installation. Thus, the find confirmed a direct connection of the perpetrator of the missing person cases to forestry, and clearly pointed to an employee of the forestry operation or a forester. This was clear evidence that confirmed the previously arising suspicions. Parallel to the main investigation line, an unusual version emerged that was proposed by a local hobby historian. He suspected that such finds could be part of an old Sami ritual connected to local shamanic practices. The version sounded unusual and even exotic, which is why the investigation was forced to turn to a professional ethnologist from Uppsala University. He quickly and argumentatively refuted the assumption of a shamanic origin of the finds, and pointed out that the described practices and rituals absolutely did not correspond to Sami traditions and culture. The false trail with the shaman was officially closed. However, the most important discovery of this day was yet to come. After the police checked the inventory number of the found copper gudgeon in the old archives of the local forest administration, they received decisive confirmation. This number completely matched the boat that had been officially assigned to a forester named Stig Eklund in the distant year 1975. The name Eklund had already appeared in the archive documents among the 12 foresters who had received the Husqvarna chains in 1976 that had previously been found in the root cellar. Now, however, the new evidence, the copper detail of the boat, led the investigations definitively to a concrete person whose name had remained only a note on paper for years. The next phase of the investigation was unavoidable. The police immediately requested all available information about the current whereabouts and living circumstances of Stig Eklund. Questioning this person became an absolute necessity and priority to definitively confirm or exclude his involvement in the series of missing person cases that had tormented the region for almost half a century. It became clear that the police were closer to solving the case, which was considered unsolvable, than ever before. The name Stig Eklund now sounded in the investigators' offices was noted in reports and documents, but it was decided not to be too hasty with conclusions. Only a personal conversation with him could shed light on the mystery that had surrounded the forests of Holmsveden since the 1970s. For the first time in a long while, there was the figure of a concrete suspect in the case. And for the first time, the police felt that the truth was finally only one step away from being solved. On the 14th of May 2023, the investigation team arrived at a nursing home in Gällivare, located far in northern Sweden. Their main target was Stig Eklund, a former forester whose name had been heard increasingly often in police offices in recent days. Despite his advanced age of 83 years, Eklund remained a strong man who looked straight and confidently, as if expecting guests. No one from the staff noticed unrest in him, but the investigators immediately sensed the tension. During the search of Eklund's room, the police made an important find. Under a pile of old newspapers and magazines, they discovered a worn atlas of Holmsveden National Park. On the pages, the old man had marked with a pen the dates of the missing person cases that corresponded to the police archive data. The markings were made carefully, almost methodically, with the precision typical of a forester. This find became the first serious evidence against Eklund. On the same day, the investigators questioned a former colleague of Eklund who confirmed, in the service book for the year 1976, it was noted that only one person had received the chain for the Husqvarna brand chainsaw, Stig Eklund himself. Thus, the chain found in the root cellar was definitively attributed to a concrete person. Another important testimony was the words of Eklund's neighbor in the nursing home, Carl Svensson. He remembered that Eklund had spoken several times with guests who came to the home, often young people, and mentioned a certain elk place. The neighbor had attached no significance to this and thought it was memories of old times. Now it sounded completely different. The legitimate question arose, could Stig Eklund, an elderly man, be physically capable of transporting the missing persons? The review of archive data confirmed that Eklund had worked as a lumberjack from the 1970s to the 1990s. His physical condition was excellent, which colleagues and personal medical records from that time confirmed. This meant that transporting persons and objects in those years was quite possible for him. During conversations with the nursing home staff, someone expressed doubt and explained that Eklund had practically not left his room in recent years, which seemed to exclude his involvement in recent events. The investigators took this information seriously and began checking the journals and duty schedules of the nurses who regularly visited Eklund. However, a detailed review revealed the opposite. In the nurses' duty schedules, periods were noted when Eklund was absent at night, sometimes for several hours at a stretch, usually until 1 o'clock in the morning. These periods were not explained by the staff, and the version of his complete immobility was officially closed. Thus, the police definitively confirmed that Eklund could indeed move around freely at night in recent years. The most significant discovery of the day was a forensic find from the Jordkällare in Holmsveden. On a metal rivet of the cellar door, which the police had sent for further analysis, fresh traces of human skin epithelium were found. The genetic examination quickly delivered a result. It was a DNA sample from Eklund himself. The fact that fresh epithelium was present meant that the old forester had recently visited the Jordkällare, which was located 1.5 kilometers away from the hut, where previously a mysterious man had repeatedly been noticed. The distance from the hut to the Jordkällare was exactly 1.4 kilometers and could be covered on foot in 20 minutes. This evidence became the decisive confirmation that Stig Eklund was directly connected with the mystery of the forest cellar and the missing persons cases that had plagued Holmsveden for decades. On the basis of all collected evidence, the copper gudgeon from the boat, the chainsaw chain, the markings in the atlas, and now the irrefutable evidence in the form of DNA on the door of the Jordkällare, the police made the final decision to bring charges against Stig Eklund. The investigators immediately began preparing the documents for the official arrest and the beginning of the court proceedings. It became obvious that the long-standing story, accompanied by uncertainty and rumors, was approaching its final and logical solution. The name Eklund was now clearly and officially connected with every disappearance, with every find, and no one at the police doubted anymore that the clarification of the case was a matter of the next few days. After almost half a century of silence and doubts, It was time to learn the truth.